Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soft, something warm, and something so wonderfully uneventful that your eyelids should already be considering early retirement. So go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe find that one pillow that somehow always migrates to the floor at 3 a.m. tonight. We're drifting gently, very gently, into the sleepy corners of Greek mythology. And we're starting with the goddess who is basically the celestial embodiment of, please keep it down, I'm trying to sit here, Hestia. She isn't the thunder-hurling, drama-stirring type. She doesn't sprout snakes from her head, she doesn't turn anyone into a pine tree for looking at her sideways, and she doesn't bother seducing mortals in the shape of a swan. She just tends a fire. Quietly. Consistently. Eternally. The Olympians were basically a divine soap opera, and she was the one character in the background who kept the set from burning down. So let's settle in. Slow breathing. Slow thoughts. And let's float lazily into the story of the goddess who never raised her voice, never sought attention, and never inspired a single summer blockbuster because, frankly, she wasn't interested in any of that. Because she's the goddess of the hearth. And the hearth is literally the spiritual equivalent of a warm cup of herbal tea. And with that, let's drift into her quiet corner of Olympus. Hestia, eldest daughter of Kronos and Rhea, technically arrived first among the divine siblings. Not that it earned her much, other than being swallowed by her father. Classic Kronos move. He saw a baby, assumed it was a threat to his job security, and resolved the issue with the least imaginative method possible. But unlike her flashier siblings, Zeus hurling lightning tantrums and Poseidon generating earthquakes every time someone forgot to praise his horses, Hestia emerged from this whole digestive mishap with exactly zero ambitions for power. You'd think being swallowed as an infant would traumatize someone into overcompensation. Maybe start collecting followers. Or aggressively brand themselves. But no. Hestia came out with the emotional profile of a warm blanket. She didn't chase glory. She didn't demand temples on every corner. She didn't insist on a publicist. She simply claimed the hearth, both in Olympus and in every Greek household. Think of her as the goddess responsible for things running smoothly, quietly, and without anyone tripping over a burning log. While Zeus was out there casually destabilizing geopolitical alliances and fathering half the Mediterranean, Hestia was the one maintaining the only flame on Olympus that never went out. Which, honestly, must have been a full-time job considering Dionysus's track record of knocking things over. The hearth in Greek life wasn't just a stove. It was the center of the home, the symbolic core where families gathered, meals were made, and offerings were placed. In a world without coffee machines, Wi-Fi, or even functioning personal boundaries, the hearth was the emotional anchor. And the Greeks trusted Hestia to keep that anchor steady. Her divine portfolio was simple: warmth, home, stability. The kind of things mortals actually needed. Compare that to Ares, god of going to war because someone looked at you funny. Or Aphrodite, goddess of double texting and bad romantic decisions. Hestia's influence was quieter, almost subtle, but constant. And constant is surprisingly valuable in a pantheon where the leadership style resembled a chaotic group chat at 3 a.m. One of the most relaxing things about Hestia, honestly, is that she opted out of conflict entirely. She didn't want a throne. She didn't want followers competing in dramatic rituals on her behalf. She didn't need temples larger than your average shipping warehouse. She just asked for the first offering at every sacrifice. And she always got it. Not because she demanded it, but because the Greeks collectively went, yeah, that seems fair. Let's keep the house fire goddess happy. It's a very reasonable sentiment. No one wants their cooking fire to go rogue. But Hestia's real moment of cosmic chill came when Dionysus joined the pantheon. The young, enthusiastic newcomer needed a seat among the Olympians. Problem: there were only 12. The Greeks loved the number 12. It was tidy, symmetrical, mathematically pleasing. No one wanted to bump someone off the roster. Except maybe Ares, but no one takes his suggestions seriously. So Hestia, in classic Hestia fashion, simply said, "Take mine." If the other gods had group meetings, this would have been the moment where everyone stopped arguing long enough to blink in confusion. She didn't storm, yell, or passive-aggressively slam a clay pot. She just stepped aside. And not in a tragic, martyrish way. More like someone politely excusing themselves from a crowded elevator because they didn't really want to be there in the first place. Thus Dionysus became an Olympian. And Hestia? She took her place at the center of the home fires, utterly unbothered. Being on the main council would have meant dealing with Zeus's quarterly scandals, Hera's ongoing HR complaints, and Apollo's music rehearsals. Opting out was probably a wellness decision. If Greek mythology had employee satisfaction surveys, Hestia's results would have been immaculate. Let's float over to a quietly amusing detail. The Greeks worshipped Hestia not with loud processions or wild festivals, but with peaceful domestic rituals. When a family moved into a new home, they brought fire from the public hearth to kindle their own. It's like a spiritual housewarming gift, except instead of wine they carried literal burning flames in clay torch holders. And Hestia presided over it all with the calmness of someone who had never once flipped a table. Contrast this with some of her peers. Fixus, a man, or god, who responded to stress by turning into animals and kidnapping people. Or Poseidon, who was basically the ancient world's worst neighbor, constantly shaking the ground like he was testing the limits of divine subwoofers. Or Hera, queen of keeping receipts and filing complaints that lasted centuries. But then, quietly, there was Hestia, the one goddess no hero dared to offend. Which is particularly funny because Greek heroes offended everyone. If you gave them 15 minutes and a coastline, they'd insult at least 2 divinities and a nymph. Yet even they knew not to mess with the hearth. Mostly because without fire, life was extremely inconvenient. She wasn't a goddess of big gestures. She was the goddess of routine, of reliability, of that little flame you used to heat olive oil for the 50th time this week because ancient Greek cuisine did not believe in variety. There's also her admirable refusal to participate in romantic drama. Everyone else in Olympus seemed programmed to create complicated love triangles, squares, or in some cases, let's be honest, geometric disasters. But Hestia took a vow of chastity and held it. Apollo, the golden-haired overachiever, once attempted to court her. He probably brought his lyre. He probably sang. He probably made intense eye contact. And she calmly declined. Not rudely, not dramatically, just declined. Then Poseidon tried. Because, of course, he did. And she also declined. It's impressive when you think about it. Olympus was a place where relationships were basically chaotic side quests. Hestia said, "No thanks," and carried on with her eternal flame tending. And the other gods went, "All right, fair enough." Which is a level of respect they did not give anyone else. Ask Aphrodite, or Artemis, or literally anyone who ever met Zeus. Hestia's vow of chastity wasn't born from fear of drama. She just preferred peace. Quiet. Honestly, she was the introvert of Olympus. She lived in the divine equivalent of a cozy studio apartment and enjoyed it. She was also one of the only deities no one cursed. People cursed the sea. They cursed storms. They cursed their crops. They cursed love. They cursed war. But no one cursed the hearth, because that was the thing standing between them and a cold dinner. It's also worth noting that Hestia existed in a state of divine minimalism. She had no flashy symbols, no iconic weapon, no entourage of winged assistants, no sacred animal charging through forests or accidentally trampling unsuspecting shepherds. Her most significant emblem was fire. Just fire. The thing humans already had to deal with every day. And she didn't even insist the flames be impressive. Not blazing infernos or divine pyrotechnics. Just a gentle flame. The kind you can stare into while contemplating warm bread or your life choices. Even in temples, the priestesses didn't throw elaborate festivals for her. There were no dramatic reenactments. No torrid myths to retell. No traveling poets singing about her in exchange for dinner. Just a quiet acknowledgement, like a nod between 2 people sitting in the same peaceful room. Hestia wasn't ignored because she was irrelevant. She was respected because she was essential. Like the hinge of a door. You don't write poems about it, but you definitely notice when it stops working. In a pantheon full of supernatural theatrics, Hestia was the goddess who reminded people that home existed. That warmth existed. That safety existed. The Greeks didn't always have a peaceful world, but they did have the hearth. Her flame was the symbol of continuity in a culture that believed gods could cause earthquakes if they woke up cranky. Her presence in myth isn't dramatic. It's consistent, quiet, a soft background glow, a presence rather than a performance. And in its own way, that makes her one of the most powerful figures in Greek mythology. She didn't need battles or scandals. She didn't need to chase influence. She didn't need poetic epics. She was the goddess whose power was felt most when nothing chaotic was happening, when the world was stable, when dinner was warm, when the home was calm. Imagine being a deity whose main miracle is keeping everything fine. It's beautifully boring, perfectly serene, and absolutely ideal for falling asleep. We sink back into the quiet glow of Hestia's influence, but now it moves outward, beyond Olympus, beyond the everyday Greek household, into the stories of heroes who, despite their reputations for breaking things, still depended on the goddess of the hearth to keep their lives from collapsing into total chaos. It's a gentle truth hidden behind all the monster slaying and quest completing. Even the most dramatic figures in Greek myth eventually went home. And when they did, Hestia's flame was waiting there like a patient parent silently thinking, "Please take off your sandals before you track dirt all over the place." There's something oddly relaxing about viewing Greek heroes through the domestic lens. Strip away the armor, the applause, the occasional divine paternity, and they all share the same fundamental need: warmth, food, shelter. And no matter how many boars they stabbed or labyrinths they navigated, they couldn't provide any of that without a hearth. So we drift to a place where myth quiets down, where the clashing swords are replaced with the soft crackle of firewood, and heroism becomes something less glamorous and more human. Hestia didn't personally supervise their quests, but her presence followed them like the lingering scent of charcoal on a traveler returning home. Take Odysseus, for example. A man with the personality of someone who would overcomplicate a recipe just to say he invented it. He spent 20 years away from Ithaca, improvising his way through the Mediterranean, gathering trauma like souvenirs. But the real end of his story, the quiet, exhaled ending, is the moment he steps back into his palace, walks past the ruins of all the chaos that's happened there, and arrives at the hearth. Homer doesn't linger on it, but the poetic silence is there. Hestia's presence is implied in the fire still burning, still offering light, still marking the home as alive. For all the storms, curses, shipwrecks, and unwanted detours, it's the hearth that brings Odysseus back into the rhythm of normal life. No more Calypso. No more Cyclops. Just warmth. The Greeks didn't need to say Hestia's name in these moments. The hearth made her visible enough. Odysseus's reunion with his home is framed not by Zeus's thunder or Athena's strategy, but by the slow return to domestic stillness. Even Penelope's weaving, the symbol of her long endurance, happens near the hearth. It's a kind of gentle cosmic irony. While Odysseus was busy proving himself clever in a dozen dangerous ways, the goddess who anchored his entire sense of home was the quiet one who never left. Another good example floats in with Heracles. Yes, the famously angry, famously brawny son of Zeus, who solved most of his problems with brute strength and regrettable fashion choices. His myths are a collection of "please don't try this at home" scenarios. But it's worth remembering that Heracles' story begins in a place of domestic tension, the hearth. This is where Hera, embodying her lifelong commitment to holding grudges, sent 2 snakes to kill baby Heracles as he lay in the nursery. The hearth wasn't just the center of the home, it was the symbol of legitimacy, safety, and protection. And Hera wanted to threaten that symbol. But even here, with monstrous serpents slithering across the floor, the hearth remained untouched. Heracles handled the snakes. Hestia's flames stayed steady. Even ancient storytellers seemed to understand that the hearth was off-limits. You could throw serpents at the crib, but you didn't mess with the fire. Heracles later returned home between labors, brief, weary pauses where the hearth marked the difference between the world of monsters and the world of mortals. Despite being the sort of man who could accidentally crush furniture just by sitting on it too hard, he needed that quiet warmth the same as anyone else. He wasn't welcome everywhere. People feared him. Monsters hated him. Kings used him. But Hestia? She simply offered warmth whenever he passed through. No judgment. No commentary about the lion's skin or the giant club. Just flame. Even someone like Heracles, powered almost entirely by muscle and poor impulse control, needed Hestia to remind him he belonged somewhere. Then there's Theseus, hero of Athens, slayer of the Minotaur, and enthusiastic abandoner of inconvenient women. His entire myth is a cautionary tale about charisma without follow-through. But what's gently amusing is that Athens, the city that adored him, relied on Hestia just as much as he did. Athens had a public hearth in the Prytanean, tended constantly. When Theseus supposedly returned to unify the region of Attica under the central city, his reforms didn't touch the hearth. He could reorganize politics, redistribute land, and establish festivals. Typical Theseus, I can fix this energy, but he didn't dare adjust the flame that symbolized Athenian stability. Even for a hero with a tendency to make sweeping decisions, Hestia's fire was a fixed point he treated with quiet respect. He may have forgotten to change the sails on his ship and caused his father to leap into the sea, but he remembered not to disturb the communal hearth. You can make your mistakes, the myths seem to say, but don't mess with the flame. Jason, on the other hand, is a case study in someone who should not be allowed near a hearth unsupervised. The Argonauts' expedition begins with a little domestic detail. Jason arriving in Iolcus wearing a single sandal, clear sign that the man could trip over absolutely anything, and stepping right into a conflict over family legacy. But before he sailed, before he collected a band of heroes, before he invited the dramatic entrance of Medea, there was a ritual at the hearth. Greek heroes often sought blessings before embarking on quests, and these blessings almost always included the flame. No one wanted to start a dangerous sea voyage without acknowledging the goddess who allowed homes to exist in the first place. Jason's voyage is one of the most chaotic in mythology: storms, giants, harpies, trials, enchantresses, and yet the hearth is the quiet thread leading back to stability. Even the golden fleece, his shiny prize, is guarded by a dragon in a sacred grove, but ultimately, the fleece is meant to restore Jason's claim at home. It's not just a trophy. It's a domestic symbol wrapped in a heroic journey. And, of course, Jason then proceeds to ruin his domestic life in spectacular fashion by abandoning Medea and forgetting basic emotional intelligence. But the hearth remains a silent witness. Even in tragedy, Hestia's flame keeps burning, untouched by human decisions, good or terrible. We can drift now to a softer figure, Orpheus. Not a hero of brute strength or political ambition, but of music. A man whose lyre could soothe storms, charm animals, and occasionally convince underworld administrators to bend protocol. But his relationship to the hearth is simple and deeply human. After losing Eurydice the first time, Orpheus is described sitting by fires, singing songs of grief. These aren't the dramatic, world-shifting fires of Hephaestus. They're Hestia's ordinary flames, warm, gentle, flickering by lamplight. When Orpheus mourned, he didn't go to a battlefield or a temple. He went to a hearth. It's understated, but comforting. Even in mythic sorrow, the hearth becomes the companion. Hestia doesn't intervene. She's not consoling him with divine insight. She just holds space for him through the warmth of the fire, a quiet presence without commentary. For a pantheon famous for meddling, Hestia's silence is refreshing. Another thread worth following drifts through the hospitality myths. Several heroes, often disguised as beggars, which was the ancient Greek equivalent of trying to go incognito with sunglasses and a hood, enter homes seeking shelter. The hearth is the test of the host's character. Would they offer warmth? A seat by the fire? A meal? Hestia presided over these moments without judgment, simply observing the natural kindness, or lack thereof, of humans. She didn't punish rude hosts or reward generous ones. She just kept the flame steady while other gods formed their opinions. In stories where Zeus and Hermes wandered the world in disguise, looking for good-hearted families, the confirmation of someone's virtue often came down to what they offered at the hearth. Food for strangers wasn't about generosity alone, it was acknowledging that warmth belonged to everyone. Even heroes recognized this. They appealed not only to Zeus's authority or Athena's wisdom but to Hestia's house-centered comfort. It's hard to be dramatic beside a hearth. The flame softens people, slows them. Even epic figures find themselves speaking in quieter tones, telling simpler stories, relaxing their guard. The hearth pulls everyone into the same gentle rhythm. We can drift to a more obscure figure, Hestia, the hero who tamed Pegasus and then made the unfortunate career decision to attempt flying to Olympus, a move that fell somewhere between ambitious and catastrophically ill-advised. But before all that, Bellerophon, like other exiled heroes, spent time seeking hospitality from kings and nobles. The first thing offered? The hearth. Imagine the contrast. A man destined to fly on a winged horse later sits quietly at a fire, eating bread, watching the embers glow. Hestia's presence frames these moments of rest, reminding the listener that even heroes require downtime. The myths don't describe her intervening, but she's there in the architecture of the story. She's always there when a hero needs to pause. It's almost funny how the Greeks built their most exciting adventures on top of a foundation of domestic warmth. Slay this monster, capture that bull, retrieve that artifact, but don't forget to eat. Don't forget to rest. Don't forget the hearth waiting back home. Hestia had a habit, if we can call it that, of slipping into the background like the quiet roommate who never leaves dishes in the sink. And in the world of Greek myth, where everyone else had a personal talent for shouting, plotting, stealing cattle, hurling thunderbolts, or turning rivals into unfortunate plant life, that alone made her unusual. Not impressive, not awe-inspiring, just pleasantly, wonderfully uneventful. Which is honestly why the ancient Greeks liked her so much. They didn't worship her the way they worshipped, say, Zeus with his, "I swear I'll behave this time," energy. They didn't fear her like they feared Poseidon, who was always one good tantrum away from sinking the coastline. And they didn't gossip about her like they did with Aphrodite, who collected scandals the way some people collect seashells. With Hestia, things were calm, quiet, predictable. And in a world where gods treated fidelity like a loose suggestion, a little predictability was deeply soothing. Hestia's whole personality revolved around the hearth. Literally, that small, glowing center of a home that never tried to impress anyone. Just warm, steady light. That was her. And the Greeks, who loved a good metaphor almost as much as they loved a good tragedy, made her the divine symbol of that soft, low-burning flame that makes a house feel like someone actually lives in it. Her siblings had the dramatic headlines. Hestia had the equivalent of page 3, tiny column, local goddess continues to be nice, reliable. And honestly, she seemed fine with that. Let's ease into her general approach to life, which can probably best be summarized as, avoid conflict, keep the fire going, and maybe don't marry anyone who could turn into a swan, a bull, or a shower of gold at any moment. She was the eldest born and the youngest born at the same time, because Cronus swallowed his children and then spit them back up in reverse order. So technically, she entered the world first and re-entered second. A very Greek kind of paradox. When your origin story begins with your father consuming you because he fears his own offspring, you'd think you'd grow into someone a bit dysfunctional. Maybe prone to therapy. Maybe a touch of divine resentment. But Hestia just didn't. While the rest of the Olympians carried around cosmic trauma like fashion accessories, Hestia simply stepped aside from the parade of dramatics. She didn't claim a flashy domain like the sky or sea or underworld. She didn't boss mortals around. She didn't throw lightning or anchor storms or curse anyone's cattle. She just kept the fire lit, kept families steady, kept the center warm. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. And the Greeks knew it mattered. Every city-state, no matter how obsessed they were with warfare, philosophy, or the annual debate over whose olive trees were better, maintained a public hearth dedicated to her. It was like the city's spiritual pilot light. Always burning, always tended. And if a new colony was founded, settlers brought a flame from Hestia's hearth with them so that their new home started warmed by the same flame as the old one. A little ancient world version of continuity. Like the divine equivalent of forwarding your mail. Now, her avoidance of chaos wasn't accidental. The other gods were exhausting. Zeus alone could drain anyone's social battery in 5 minutes. No wonder Hestia opted out of the big Olympian throne competition, offering her seat to Dionysus because, let's be honest, he needed somewhere to sit after all those wine festivals. And she certainly didn't need the extra attention. Stepping aside was her specialty. She did it again when Poseidon and Apollo both asked for her hand in marriage. Which, to be clear, was not necessarily flattering in the way one might imagine. The pool of immortal bachelors was limited, and none of them were particularly stable. Poseidon had the marine equivalent of road rage. Apollo had the emotional resilience of a slightly bruised apricot. Neither screamed, "Ideal partner." So Hestia took the vows of eternal chastity, declared she would remain unmarried, and both men backed off. A goddess choosing peace over romance was apparently shocking enough that Zeus granted her a permanent, honored place at Olympus anyway. Without drama. Without a trial. Without bribery. Without metamorphosis-driven seduction attempts. Miracles really do happen. But her commitment to calm didn't mean she was boring. Not truly. Quiet people never are. It's simply that Hestia's influence was subtle, woven through the everyday rhythms of Greek life instead of blasting through myths with giant set pieces. She wasn't the star of epic poems because epics require battles, quests, storms, curses, or someone sprouting wings and flying away in emotional distress. Hestia had none of that. What she had was presence. A soft, steady sort of gravity. Like the goddess equivalent of a warm mug of something mildly herbal. Nothing exciting, but suddenly you feel grounded enough to get through your day. Greek households acknowledged her before any other deity. When a fire was lit, she was honored first. When sacrifices were offered, she received the opening portion. Not because she demanded it, Hestia was not particularly demanding, but because she represented everything that held daily life together. Which, in the ancient world, was a lot more valuable than it sounds. Hearth fire meant warmth. It meant food. It meant safety. It meant community. A thing quiet enough to ignore but necessary enough to notice when it's gone. In a way, she was the emotional infrastructure of civilization. Let's drift a bit deeper into how her quiet presence contrasted with her family's, let's call them, patterns. Take Zeus and Hera, whose marriage functioned like a centuries-long competition of who can be more petty today? Or Ares, who treated warfare like a hobby he refused to outgrow. Or Artemis and Apollo, whose sibling rivalry sometimes resulted in actual mythical casualties. Then there was Hermes, who would steal anything not nailed down and then pretend it was a joke. Meanwhile, Hestia was at home tidying the divine equivalent of a living room. She didn't join the Olympian wars. She didn't pick sides in conflicts. She didn't declare favorites among mortals. Her most dramatic act was probably rejecting multiple marriage proposals in a single afternoon. In Greek mythology, that practically counts as an action scene. Even the Romans, who loved rebranding Greek gods like they were running a celestial marketing firm, adored her. Vesta, her Roman form, became the heart of Roman domestic and civic stability. The Vestal virgins tended her sacred flame in a ritual so important that forgetting to do it properly could be taken as a national crisis. Rome could survive invading Gauls, scheming emperors, plagues, and questionable urban planning decisions. But a neglected hearth fire? Absolutely terrifying. This is the kind of influence Hestia had. Calm, quiet, essential. Not the sort of deity who filled theaters with dramatic retellings, but the sort of deity whose presence you felt every time someone cooked, gathered, sheltered, or simply stayed warm. The quiet moments of life were hers. And in ancient thought, quiet moments mattered deeply. Now, if we follow her mythological arc, it becomes clear she never once tried to overshadow anyone. She didn't chase glory. She didn't pursue power. She didn't even join arguments unless absolutely forced, and even then, she resolved them without throwing a lightning bolt, which put her in a very exclusive minority. Her version of drama management was listening calmly and stepping between the participants until they gave up out of sheer confusion. In a family so chaotic, that kind of neutrality was a superpower. She had no enemies, no rivals, no tragic feuds, no dramatic punishments. No cursed lovers. No monstrous offspring. No heroic quests. She just existed in serene, steady faithfulness to her role. Which is probably why so few grand myths survive about her. The ancient storytellers preferred tales full of conflict, betrayal, complex voyages, seasickness, lions, and emotional spirals. Hestia didn't provide that. She provided the thing those heroes wanted after all their suffering was over: home. Warmth. A safe return. In the Homeric hymn dedicated to her, she's praised with a softness rarely given to gods. She is first and last among the gods, recognized not for destruction or conquest but for her soothing presence. The Greeks were not subtle people, but when they described Hestia, subtlety suddenly appeared in their vocabulary. She was the goddess who didn't need to prove anything. And that quiet confidence, that gentle assurance, made her genuinely comforting. Let's drift a little more into the notion of the hearth as a symbolic center. In Greek households, the hearth wasn't just where meals were cooked or warmth was gathered. It was a boundary between the domestic world and the outside chaos, between the structured life of the family and the unpredictable world beyond the walls. When children were born, they were carried around the hearth as a welcoming ritual. When new members joined a household, they were honored at the hearth. When sacrifices were made, the hearth was the first recipient. The hearth was the pulse of the home. Hestia was the divine embodiment of that pulse. She didn't conquer cities. She didn't bless armies. She didn't curse anyone with creatively poetic punishments. She oversaw the act of simply living, of being together, of sharing warmth. And because of that, she became the goddess everyone relied on without quite noticing. The way people rely on a quiet person who always brings the snacks, always remembers everyone's birthday, always offers a place to sit and breathe. If she ever disappeared, civilization would collectively panic. But because she never did, everyone simply continued life comfortably, assuming the warmth would always be there. Chapter 4. The Art of Divine Minimalism. Hestia had a kind of spiritual minimalism that would have made modern lifestyle bloggers foam at the mouth with admiration. Not the braggy kind. No, 10 ways I simplified my Olympus routine scrolls being passed around by satyrs, but the natural, effortless sort that comes from someone who genuinely prefers quiet over spectacle. And in Greek mythology, where spectacle was practically a competitive sport, that preference turned her into a quiet anomaly. Everyone else on Olympus needed attention the way Dionysus needed hydration the morning after an all-night festival. Zeus had to show off leadership he barely possessed. Hera demanded the respect she absolutely deserved but rarely got. Athena insisted on being the smartest person in the room. Apollo practically tripped over himself to remind people how charming he was. Ares couldn't keep his indoor voice indoors. And Hestia just kept the flame steady. While the others used their divine personas as a way to avoid dealing with, well, anything internally, Hestia's power was simply existing without causing chaos. A rare gift. The Greeks might not have written epic poems about her, but they quietly realized, this one keeps everything from falling apart. Her minimalism wasn't about deprivation. It was about boundaries. Something the rest of the Olympians lacked entirely. They were like cosmic toddlers running around with dangerous objects, and Hestia was the silent, responsible older sibling who gently moved breakable items out of reach. Take her refusal to ride into myths like she was auditioning for a heroic intervention. Most gods couldn't resist. Hermes once helped steal cows just because it was Tuesday. Artemis shot people for looking at her the wrong way, which is quite a boundary-setting technique, though not one mortals generally appreciated. Even Demeter, generally stable, went full scorched earth the moment her daughter was missing. Hestia didn't do any of that. No revenge arcs. No legendary standoffs. No impulsive transformations. Not even a quietly judgmental side-eye moment recorded in a hymn. She embodied what historians sometimes call the gentle center, which is a polite way of admitting she didn't cause problems. And within mythology, that made her deeply trustworthy. In a world of morally flexible immortals, trustworthiness was almost exotic. Let's drift gently into how her minimalism shaped Greek ritual life. Because while she rarely enters the myths directly, Her presence is felt in nearly every religious practice. Walk into an ancient Greek household, just mentally of course, and you'd find a small, steady fire burning. It wasn't decorative, it wasn't optional. It was the living core of domestic space, the quiet heartbeat around which meals were cooked and families gathered. That fire was Hestia. Not metaphorically, literally. Every flame drawn from that hearth was thought to be connected to her divine flame, which meant every home had a direct line to her. She was the only Olympian consistently inside every household, not elbowing her way in like Hermes or crashing in uninvited like Zeus. She was simply welcomed. And the Greeks loved predictability. They may have written tragedies full of people making disastrous choices, but in real life they adored routines. Lighting the morning fire, offering a small portion of food, inviting prosperity in without fanfare. All of these moments were tiny nods to Hestia. In many ways, she wasn't the goddess of fire, she was the goddess of continuity. And continuity was a precious commodity in ancient Greek life. Cities warred, harvests failed, empires shifted, heroes died in spectacularly avoidable ways. But the hearth? The hearth remained. Let's drift a little deeper into her role in civic life. Every Greek city-state had a public hearth, an official, always burning flame representing the community's stability. It was where officials gathered, where oaths were taken, where unity was symbolized without grand speeches or dramatic ceremonies. Hestia presided over all of it without leaving her seat. Even when new colonies were founded, settlers didn't just pack up their belongings and sail off. They first lit a torch from the city hearth, Hestia's flame, and carried it to their new settlement. A practical, symbolic, and spiritually comforting gesture all in one. The new community wasn't starting cold. It carried the warm memory of the old home, wrapped in divine protection. It was like maintaining connection during a major life change. The ancient equivalent of bringing a piece of your old home decor to your new apartment so it doesn't feel completely unfamiliar. Only, with a goddess attached. Hestia's minimalism also extended to her appearance. Unlike many goddesses who insisted on dramatic styling, Aphrodite had her goddess glam, Athena had her armored chic, Hestia's iconography was modest. Not dowdy, just quiet. Flowing garments, a veil, maybe a branch or small vessel. Nothing that screamed, "Look at me." More like, "Here, have a sense of calm." And people adored her for it. Even poets who typically ignored her in favor of flashier gods occasionally paused long enough to call her things like gentle Hestia or she who sits in the center. Not commanding the center, not guarding the center, just quietly embodying it. She was both the literal and metaphorical middle point. Now, considering her family, that was no small achievement. The entire Olympian clan operated like a mythological soap opera with more curses and fewer commercial breaks. They lived for conflict. But Hestia's minimalism meant she didn't get involved unless her involvement prevented others from breaking the universe. A good example is the whole Poseidon-Apollo marriage proposition incident. Most goddesses would have seen proposals from two powerful Olympians as leverage or a prelude to disaster. Hestia saw them as invitations to long-term inconvenience. So she removed the problem entirely by pledging eternal virginity. A simple solution. Quiet, decisive, minimalistic. Her approach to mythological politics could be summed up as, no thank you. Even her relationship with Zeus was unusually calm. While many Olympians navigated Zeus's mercurial moods with varying degrees of anxiety, Hera with thinly veiled irritation, Ares with loud defiance, Hermes with a smirk, Hestia simply coexisted. She wasn't intimidated by him. She wasn't overly deferential. She also wasn't competing with him. And that neutrality earned his respect. So much so that he rewarded her with a permanent seat at Olympus and the assurance that she would always be honored first in sacrifices. It was probably the easiest negotiation Zeus ever had. Her minimalistic nature even showed up in her divine duties. She didn't have a chariot team, no animal entourage, no elaborate temples, no shrines that required 4 priests and a small choir. All she needed was a lit flame, which made her one of the most accessible deities for ordinary people. In many city-states, there wasn't even a statue of Hestia in the public hearth house. The flame was her representation. That was enough. The flame burned. She was present. Simple, elegant, minimalistic. Now, let's drift into how she shaped the emotional landscape of Greek households. The hearth wasn't just warmth, though that mattered. It represented psychological security, connection, a place where disagreements settled, families formed, and community rituals grounded people in stability. Hestia presided over every one of those intangible moments without demanding offerings or orchestrating spectacle. She was the guardian of the quiet moments humans barely noticed, putting on a pot of stew, sharpening tools by the firelight, staying warm on a winter evening, sharing a meal with guests. Those were the everyday rituals that kept social life functioning. And Hestia stood at the center of all of them. Her minimalism also made her deeply trusted in a way few gods were. Many deities helped mortals, but their help came with fine print. Gifts that turned into curses. Blessings that required sacrifice. Aid that ended in lessons or emotional complication. Hestia didn't do fine print. She didn't demand. She didn't punish. She didn't test. If you honored the hearth, she honored you back with warmth and steadiness. A refreshingly simple system in a mythological universe built on narrative twists. Even her presence in odes reflected that simplicity. Greeks often invoked Hestia when making promises not because she enforced them but because her steady nature symbolized sincerity. Swearing by Hestia was like saying, "I intend to be as consistent as the hearth flame." She represented reliability in a world defined by uncertainty. And in Greek literature, reliability was rare enough to be divine. Let's glide now into her symbolic role in transitions, birth, hospitality, coming of age. All of these moments involved the hearth. Every transition meant circling back to Hestia, acknowledging her as the grounding force before moving forward. When a child was introduced into the household, they were welcomed at the hearth. When a guest entered, they were given food from the hearth. When young adults completed their coming-of-age rituals, the hearth marked the start of their new place in society. Hestia was the goddess of thresholds without needing to stand on them. She represented the gentle assurance that whatever changed, the center remained. In mythological terms, that was her superpower, quiet constancy. Not glamorous, not dramatic, just deeply stabilizing. And the Greeks, who spent so much of their mythology imagining chaos, needed that center. Let's continue drifting toward another quiet aspect of her nature, one even the ancient poets only hinted at. Her refusal to be drawn out into conflict wasn't apathy. It was deliberate stillness. A choice to be the unmoving center around which everything else spun. She wasn't passive. She was grounding. She didn't avoid drama because she feared it. She avoided it because someone had to keep things steady. And in her own serene, minimalistic way, Hestia did exactly that. Let's float forward as her subtle presence continues to shape the quieter corners of the mythic world. Chapter 5. The Goddess Who Stayed Home on Purpose. Hestia's decision to stay rooted wasn't laziness. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even a lack of adventurous spirit, though she definitely wasn't the backpack across Europe type. Her steadiness was more like a cosmic choice, one of those quiet, powerful decisions that ripples outward without making a sound. And in a pantheon where everyone else tended to sprint headfirst into emotional chaos, her stillness became remarkable. Not dramatic, just quietly revolutionary. In a world of gods who thrived on movement, divine quests, epic battles, overly enthusiastic transformations, Hestia represented the place everyone eventually returned to. She didn't need to chase the myths. The myths circled back to her whether they admitted it or not. Let's ease into one of the more overlooked facts about her. She was the only Olympian with no wandering myths at all. Not a single recorded adventure. Not one trek down a mountain. Not one disguised visit to a mortal. No moments of, "Oh look, Hestia's suddenly a bird," or, "Oops, Hestia just sank a ship because someone annoyed her." Nothing. She was mythologically stationary by choice. If every god was a different type of energy, Hestia was gravity. The kind that holds everything in place without raising her voice. And this wasn't lost on the ancients. Many Greek writers, who, as a group, adored dramatic irony, saw Hestia's stillness as symbolic. Zeus ruled from on high, Poseidon from the depths, Hermes from every road at once. But Hestia ruled the center. She didn't need a domain spanning oceans or skies because she was the literal anchor of divine and human worlds alike. Her throne sat in the middle of Olympus, not because she demanded placement but because the gods themselves needed a center point to gather around. And Hestia, being the only deity genuinely capable of sitting still for more than 3 minutes, naturally filled the role. The Olympians had a lot of power, but hardly any stability. Hestia supplied what they lacked. Quietly, gracefully, without reminding anyone she was doing it. Let's float a little deeper into her presence in daily life. The hearth wasn't just a household convenience, it was emotional infrastructure. A place where families warmed themselves not just physically but socially. A place where meals were shared, stories told, decisions made, and conflicts softened by the glow of firelight. Hestia presided over those everyday rhythms like an invisible guest, always welcome, never intrusive. In her temples, rare as they were, the sacred flame did all the talking. No statues towering over worshippers, no elaborate altars, no priests shouting about divine wrath. Just fire burning steadily under her watch. And that steadiness shaped the Greek understanding of community. Cities were not connected by walls or armies but by shared rituals, and Hestia's flame was the quiet thread that linked them. When a colony branched off, they took her fire first. When a marriage ceremony began, it opened with offerings to her. When a home was built, the hearth was the first thing established. She was the goddess of beginnings, not with trumpets or proclamations, but with warmth. Then there's her relationship with hospitality, something the Greeks took more seriously than most modern hotel chains. Welcoming guests wasn't just politeness. It was sacred duty, tied directly to Hestia's domain. A host's hearth represented not just warmth but moral character. To offer someone fire was to offer them a place in your world, however temporary. Hestia made hospitality divine. Not by descending dramatically to bless visitors, but by existing as the embodiment of welcome. And in a culture where strangers might be gods in disguise, because the Olympians loved surprising mortals for sport, having a goddess attached to hospitality kept things peaceful. Even Zeus, with his unpredictable sense of justice, bowed to her authority in that area. If a guest sat at the hearth, they were under Hestia's protection. No arguments. No loopholes. She didn't rule through fear or glory. She ruled through decency. Let's drift into the subtle psychology of what Hestia represented. The Greeks understood the importance of liminal spaces, thresholds, doorways, transitions. It's where change happened. But the hearth wasn't a threshold. It was the grounding point between every threshold. A place that didn't transform you, but reminded you who you already were. She was the goddess of staying. And staying in a mythological world built around quests was quietly radical. Think of all the other gods and heroes who couldn't stay still even when they wanted to. Odysseus spent 10 years trying to get home and another 10 emotionally decompressing from the trip. Heracles, poor man, spent his entire life trying to atone for one terrible moment. Even the gods wandered, Athena to wars, Apollo to oracles, Artemis to forests, and Dionysus to every festival that would let him in. Hestia stayed, not because she lacked mobility, but because she valued presence over movement. Presence was her mythology. Now, the Greeks being the Greeks, they added a symbolic layer to her stillness. Hestia's unchanging nature was seen as the cosmic counterbalance to Hermes, who was movement incarnate. He was the roads, the crossings, the messenger's path. She was the center those roads led back to. Ancient philosophers loved pairing them as opposites that kept the universe aligned. Motion and rest, journey and homecoming, threshold and hearth. Hermes could lead souls to the underworld, guide travelers across boundaries. Hestia ensured there was always a place to return to on the other side. She was the cosmic exhale after every inhale. Let's drift more into her Roman evolution, Because if there was ever a civilization that adored structure, it was Rome. They loved Hestia so much they essentially upgraded her. As Vesta, she became the guardian of the Roman state itself. And while many gods had temples across the city, Vesta had something even more important: an eternal flame in the most central part of Rome. Layers of symbolism stacked on symbolism. The Vestal virgins tended this flame with military-level discipline. Their job wasn't glamorous. It didn't involve oracles or prophecy or dramatic rituals. Their duty was, essentially, don't let the fire go out. But in Rome, that task carried immense weight. The flame represented the survival of the state. If it dimmed, Rome dimmed. If it died, Rome faltered. And all of that meaning, tense, profound, civic, came from the Greeks' quiet goddess who preferred not to leave the house. Hestia's influence spread through the ancient Mediterranean without a single mythic battle or romantic entanglement. She didn't need epics. Her power was domestic, understated, and universal. It's ironic, in a gently sleepy way, that she influenced everyone without anyone noticing. Let's float into how ancient writers described her personality, or, more accurately, how they avoided describing it. Hestia was notoriously undercharacterized, not because she lacked character, but because her traits didn't fit the mythological narrative template. She wasn't jealous like Hera, strategic like Athena, impulsive like Aphrodite, or intimidating like Artemis. She had no vendettas, no feuds, no heartbreaks, no revenge cycles. Her greatest mythic action was saying no thank you to two gods who wanted to marry her, a polite boundary-setting moment that served as her heroic arc. Most gods had complicated emotional timelines. Hestia was emotionally linear, not cold, not detached, just serene, a calmness that, in its own way, radiated authority. Even among immortals, peace was rare enough to be powerful, and mortals felt that power. Greek families saw Hestia as the protector of what they valued most: safety, warmth, connection, continuity. Her blessings weren't flashy but steady. She didn't give fortunes or victory or prophecy. She gave comfort, divine comfort, the kind that wraps around you without asking for anything in return. Let's drift into the symbolic heart of her role, the hearth as identity. For the Greeks, the household wasn't just where people lived, it was where they belonged. A social, spiritual, and economic unit all in one. The hearth fire symbolized membership. When someone left a family, they extinguished their connection to the flame. When someone joined, they were given a share of it. The hearth tracked emotional lineage, which made Hestia the goddess of belonging without needing to say a single word about it. In fact, her silence was part of her meaning. She didn't need to appear in myths. She was present before the stories began and after they ended. The beginning and the ending of sacrifices. The first and last deity invoked. The quiet bracket around every ritual. She was the frame, not the painting. But frames matter. They hold everything else together. And in her quiet way, Hestia ensured that even as the gods galloped around causing cosmic chaos, mortals always had one divine presence that didn't shift, thunder, rage, or flirt. She simply warmed the world. Gently, constantly, consistently. Let's drift forward now, following the glow of her steady flame into another quiet corner of her mythic presence. If you've ever suspected that modern companies profit just a little too enthusiastically from your inability to sleep, then let me introduce you to the Victorians, those delicate, lace-collared pioneers of monetizing human discomfort. Because the moment insomnia became a recognized condition, Victorian entrepreneurs collectively popped their monocles and said, "A market." And like a Victorian cat pouncing on a saucer of milk, the marketplace wasted zero time turning sleep into an industry. An enormous, plush, velvet-draped industry. Let's step quietly, very quietly, into this chapter and see how deeply the economics of sleep shaped the gadgets, cures, and cultural anxieties drifting through the 19th century. The birth of the Great Sleep Economy. By the 1860s, British newspapers were publishing alarming essays about the epidemic of wakefulness. The pieces were always written in that very Victorian way, somewhere between a medical warning and a personal insult. One article essentially said, "If you can't sleep, you might simply be too weak-willed to relax." That tone. Once insomnia was framed as a social failing, like poor posture or not owning enough embroidered table linens, manufacturers swooped in to fix people's moral and physical deficiencies. Thus began what historians generously call a consumer boom and what I call the Great Victorian Sleep Cash Grab. Pillows, the first luxury battleground. Victorians already loved pillows. They loved them so much they wrote pamphlets about them. So when insomnia became fashionable to complain about, pillow makers saw opportunity with a capital O. Suddenly the market exploded with hydro-orthopedic pillows, filled with water because science. Aromatic pillows stuffed with lavender, chamomile, hops, or phrenological pillows shaped around the bumps of your personality skull. Feather pillows advertised as fear-minimizing, no explanation given, naturally. One newspaper in 1873 even advertised a pillow structured to discourage unpleasant dreams, which is honestly impressive considering Freud wasn't even on the scene yet. This was pre-psychology dream management through geometry. Blanket merchants and the marketing war of warmth. Blankets also entered a kind of competitive renaissance. Wool merchants began claiming their sheep lived stress-free and thus produced calmer wool and thus created blankets that soothed nighttime anxieties, which is a very poetic way of saying, our sheep are more relaxed than your sheep, so you'll sleep better. Some companies released temperature-modulating blankets, boasting that air channels created a thermal harmony. You and I would call this holes. They called it innovation. The rise of the sleep boutique. By the late 19th century, London's wealthiest districts had specialized shops called sleep emporiums, somnolence rooms, restoration parlors, and one extremely confident store named the House of Hypnos. Inside, customers could test mattresses by lying down in private booths while clerks hovered nearby with notepads, asking things like, "Would Sir say his hip feels cradled or merely supported?" Which, look, I would simply evaporate on the spot. No amount of Victorian politeness can rescue that level of vulnerability. The business of bedtime teas. Tea companies jumped into the insomnia market too, branding their blends with names like Night Peace Tea, Gentle Hours Infusion, Sleep Quelling Draft, and my personal favorite, Sure Slumber, a tea for those who refuse to yield to night. These teas were often harmless mixtures of lavender, lemon balm, and mint. But a few, because Victorians loved to push limits, contained low doses of opiate tinctures, which made sleep tea less of a bedtime beverage and more of a polite narcotic. Sleep as a performance of class. Here is where the economics get really interesting. Victorians believed that people who slept well were morally superior, more refined, more virtuous, more balanced of temperament. This meant wealthy families had a strong incentive to appear well-rested, which led to some unusual habits. Hiring servants whose only job was to create perfect nighttime conditions. Purchasing imported linens to display restful taste. Installing heavy velvet drapes because the best families sleep in darkness. Writing in diaries about one's sound sleep as a subtle social brag. Victorians humble bragged about sleeping. This cultural pressure meant that insomnia wasn't just inconvenient, it was embarrassing. And where embarrassment exists, products soon follow. When doctors joined the marketplace, physicians of the era were not immune to the business potential of tired, anxious middle-class citizens. Many sold their own branded remedies. Dr. Wainwright's sleep preparatory syrup. Dr. Bell's patent nerve-quieting lozenges. Doctors attached their names to products the way influencers attach discount codes today. The packaging might as well have said, "Use my special formula to avoid disgrace at your next dinner party." The case of the sleep lecturers. Yes, Victorian society had these. Public speakers who gave paid lectures on the science of slumber, complete with diagrams, pseudopsychology, and occasionally live demonstrations where volunteers were guided through restorative breathing techniques. These speakers sold pamphlets at the door as well as sleep diaries, bedtime posture charts, and sometimes even proprietary bedtime hymns. Imagine attending a TED Talk, but the topic is literally how not to be awake at night. When the sleep bubble finally popped, the Victorian sleep economy never really burst, but it did eventually stabilize. People slowly realized that no pillow, no velvet head cradle, no imported Tunisian linen would fully defeat the noise of railway stations, gasworks, urban anxiety, and the general existential dread of the Industrial Revolution. As if nights weren't complicated enough in the 19th century, Victorians eventually turned their attention to another alleged threat lurking in the bedrooms of respectable citizens: nightmares. Not ordinary nightmares, mind you. According to the more excitable essayists of the era, these were moral disturbances of the sleeping mind, which is a very polite way of saying they believed bad dreams revealed character flaws. It was only a matter of time before someone said it out loud. Insomnia might be unfortunate, but nightmares? Those were suspicious. Victorian writers truly had an unmatched talent for taking something universal, harmless, and deeply human and then declaring it unfit for polite society. Nightmares as spiritual malfunctions. Long before psychologists made nightmare charts and dream dictionaries, many Victorians thought bad dreams meant your soul had bad posture. Not metaphorically, just spiritually slouched. Some clergy members wrote entire pamphlets insisting nightmares were signs of inner turmoil or evidence of an undisciplined imagination. Others blamed them on unconfessed guilt, which must have been a real treat for anyone who simply had a dream about falling off a cart because they ate too much stew. Parents were advised to monitor their children's dreams for hints of wickedness. A child dreaming of running away? Clearly rebellious. A child dreaming of candy? Evidence of gluttony. A child dreaming of absolutely nothing at all? Potential sociopath. Truly a no-win situation for the Victorian toddler. The medicalization of night terrors. Doctors, never ones to miss a trend or a chance to use Greek roots in a sentence, declared nightmares to be nocturnal paroxysms of cerebral unrest, which sounds dramatic enough to be fatal, but was usually just indigestion. Victorian physicians loved diagnosing things with full confidence, even when their treatments amounted to: drink less coffee, open a window, don't eat cheese after 6 p.m. This was medicine's golden age of firm opinions and minimal solutions. Some doctors, however, leaned harder into theory. They proposed that nightmares were a primitive evolutionary reflex, inherited from cave ancestors who slept poorly because bears existed. Another theory claimed nightmares came from microcurrents of the nervous system misfiring. Fancy words, same basic meaning. Your brain got tired of your nonsense and decided to send you to an imaginary cliff. Nightmare-proof bedrooms. Since bad dreams were considered morally suspicious, people started redesigning their bedrooms to project moral virtue. The theory was, if your room looked orderly, your mind would follow. This led to the creation of dream-quelling wallpaper in bland floral patterns, virtue pillows embroidered with calming Bible verses, properly spaced furniture because improper symmetry apparently invited chaos, harmonized bed frames meant to channel peaceful ether, whatever that meant. Architects even recommended specific room layouts to discourage nocturnal disturbances. Some families went full geometric alignment mode, moving their entire beds because a newspaper article suggested north-facing sleepers had fewer nightmares. And yes, this trend lasted long enough for multiple wallpaper companies to market themselves as soul-calming. Victorians truly could commercialize anything. Dream diets, the dawn of sleep nutritionism. Because everything eventually becomes a diet fad, Victorians also believed food caused nightmares, particularly rich or spicy dishes. Entire cookbooks began adding warnings next to recipes. Avoid before sleep may inflame the humors. Perhaps too stimulating for the bedtime hours. Not suitable for delicate constitutions after dusk. Cheese was considered especially dangerous. If you ate it at the wrong hour, the moral consequences were said to follow you into your subconscious. There were even debates over which cheeses were dream-safe. Soft cheeses? Acceptable. Aged ones? Too bold, spiritually speaking. Meanwhile, wealthy households hired kitchen staff to prepare dreamlight meals, which were bland, boiled, pale, and generally depressing. If the dish looked like it had never truly lived, it was perfect for bedtime. Philosophers joined the fun. No Victorian trend was complete until philosophers weighed in. They wrote long, soothingly dreary essays about dreams that read like someone trying very hard to sound wise while half asleep. Some argued nightmares were cultural echoes, shaped by the anxieties of modern life. Others believed they were the result of reading too many serialized novels, which Victorians consumed like snacks. One philosopher of the time confidently declared that nightmares came from the tyranny of imagination over the weaker faculties. Translation: if you had a creative brain, you were doomed. But there was also a quieter group of thinkers who took a gentler approach, suggesting nightmares were simply the brain's attempt to keep itself entertained. They didn't win many debates, but their essays were far more comforting to read at 11 p.m. The moral panic spreads to pets. In a particularly charming twist of history, some Victorians extended moral interpretations to animal behavior. If your dog whimpered in its sleep, this was not cute. Oh no. It was a sign that the animal had been exposed to unsavory influences, poor company, frightening noises, or perhaps even dark imaginings. So people began monitoring their pets' sleep environments too. Dogs got bedtime blankets. Cats got special cushions embroidered with calming motifs. Horses in expensive stables had. Astonishingly confusing for every horse involved. Nightmare clubs and the gentlemen who overthought everything. One of the strangest cultural phenomena of the era was the formation of nightmare clubs. Small groups of men who met weekly to discuss their dreams and analyze each other's perceived psychological weaknesses. Of course, they didn't call themselves nightmare clubs. They used names like the Society for Nocturnal Inquiry, the Midnight Circle, the Fellowship of Night Visions, which sounds like occult groups but was really just a lot of men with too much free time and too many opinions. Members read each other's dream journals aloud in somber tones. They debated the symbolism of turnips and staircases. They wrote minutes for the meetings. Someone always brought biscuits. Their reports survive in fragments, and trust me, you have never seen grown men agonize so intensely over the symbolic meaning of being chased by a goose. The slow decline of the nightmare epidemic. By the early 20th century, the Victorian obsession with nightmares had mellowed. Modern psychology offered more grounded explanations. People quietly stopped blaming wallpaper or cheese. Newspapers moved on to newer anxieties. And society gradually agreed that sometimes a bad dream is just a bad dream. But the legacy remained. We still talk about dream symbolism. We still worry about sleep quality. We still market calming pillows and teas. And we still create elaborate bedtime rituals to keep the mind peaceful. Victorians worried about many things: chimney sweeps, chimney smoke, moral decay, overly exciting novels, and of course, their own internal organs. But one anxiety rose quietly above the rest in the late 19th century: the terrifying possibility of sleeping in the wrong position. Entire families sat around their parlors reading articles that solemnly warned, a person who sleeps improperly invites ruin to the Constitution. And because Victorians had a special gift for turning bodily habits into moral obligations, sleep posture became a matter of virtue, discipline, and social reputation. So let's drift gently into this chapter about how people once tried to achieve physical perfection in bed without actually moving. The very serious debate about sleeping on one's back. Sleeping on your back was considered the ideal posture by many health writers, but not for reasons you might expect. No discussions of snoring or airflow. Instead, the argument was that lying flat allowed the blood to distribute itself with Republican equality. Which is amusing because Victorians rarely supported Republican equality in any other context. Doctors praised back sleeping as calm, noble, and ordered, as though your nighttime position said something profound about your temperament. One physician even claimed that those who slept on their backs had greater dignity of mind, which is such an aggressively Victorian thing to say that it feels like satire. People practiced this posture deliberately, sometimes training themselves by using cloth straps to prevent rolling. Imagine drifting off while tied down like a very willing, very determined mummy. Side sleepers, the troubled souls of the night. According to some writers, those who slept on their sides were creatures of agitation. This was considered the posture of people who worried too much or had restless passions, which is a wonderfully dramatic accusation for someone simply trying to get comfortable. Side sleeping became associated with emotional instability, weak nerves, overly active imaginations, possible digestive misadventures. One article even suggested that side sleepers were more likely to read novels late at night, which was essentially the Victorian version of this person stays up watching drama clips on their phone. Naturally, the middle class panicked. No one wanted gossip about their nighttime vulnerability. So people practiced stiff, very correct back sleeping as if it were an exam. Stomach sleepers, a social disaster. If back sleepers were noble and side sleepers were questionable, then stomach sleepers were, oh dear. Absolutely not. Victorian commentators held nothing back on this one. They believed stomach sleeping, restricted breathing, squashed vital organs, encouraged nightmares, and revealed a laxity of moral will. Several magazines printed diagrams warning readers never, under any circumstances, to allow their child to sleep face down, lest the child grow up to be a melancholic with confused habits of thought. So yes, Victorians basically invented the first sleep-shaming campaign. Some mothers even checked on their children throughout the night to ensure they hadn't rolled into forbidden positions. Imagine being an exhausted child and having your mother turn you over at 2 a.m. because the medical journal said you might develop poor moral fiber. The invention of positional devices. To maintain ideal posture, Victorians quickly developed a variety of sleep gadgets. Many looked like something between orthopedic supports and medieval punishments. There were back maintainers, padded boards tied behind the spine, side blockers, little bolsters that prevented drifting sideways, head-aligning pillows, shaped like troughs to keep the mind straight, leg positioning rolls, because crooked knees apparently spelled doom. There was even a patented device called the nocturnal corrector that resembled a padded cage placed around the sleeper to enforce stillness. Advertisements promised it would cultivate grace, composure, and internal harmony, which is and remains a fascinatingly optimistic claim. Upper-class sleep etiquette lessons. Because Victorians could turn nearly anything into etiquette, wealthy families began including sleep deportment in boarding school training. Young ladies learned how to lie down with elegance, how to turn without disturbing the sheets, how to breathe with quiet feminine propriety, and how to rise in the morning without leaving the bedclothes in disarray. Teachers gave feedback like, "Your shoulders droop in a manner unbefitting refinement. Try again, but with less visible anxiety. Remember, your posture reveals your interior state." Imagine being 14 and getting graded on your unconscious body position. The pseudoscience of organ alignment. A handful of overly confident medical writers believed that organs had preferences, little favorite spots within the torso, and that sleep posture determined whether they were happy. Some insisted. The liver disliked compression. The lungs liked wide spaces. The heart needed lower stress from gravity. And the stomach benefited from gentle incline. One well-known doctor stated that lying on one's right side was a crime against the natural intuitions of the heart. A different doctor replied publicly that it was lying on the left side that caused dangerous congestion. And so the newspapers printed both, and society collectively panicked. People started switching sides every few minutes to please everyone's opinions. Victorians must have fallen asleep exhausted from the sheer moral effort of lying down. The rise of sleep personality types. A later trend emerged in which writers classified people by sleep posture in the same way modern lifestyle blogs classify people into morning birds or chaotic night owls. These writers proposed categories such as the scholar sleeps straight on the back, the melancholic curls sideways in a defensive spiral, the dreamer drifts diagonally across the bed, the laborer falls asleep in any position without concern for dignity. The imprudent sleeps face down in reckless disregard for health. Nurses used these categories in patient notes. People whispered about each other's sleep personalities during long coach rides. Novels included subtle references to indicate a character's temperament through posture. It was an entire taxonomy of nocturnal judgment. The existential fear of too much movement. Another ubiquitous Victorian worry centered on the idea that turning too often during sleep weakened the nerves. Health writers warned that movement indicated internal chaos, and that a quiet sleeper was the sign of a balanced constitution. This meant people bragged about being perfectly still all night. One woman wrote in her diary that her fiancé slept the entire night without stirring a muscle, which she considered a romantic triumph. Meanwhile, he was probably just unconscious from working 12 hours at a textile mill. Slow acceptance of natural variation. As the 20th century approached, medical understanding, though still developing, began to acknowledge that humans were not identical mannequins. Doctors gradually admitted that people breathe differently. Organs don't actually slide around like marbles. Nightmares are not caused by spinal angles. And comfort matters more than posture purity. By the 1920s, many posture devices were quietly discontinued, and sleep manuals began using gently forgiving phrases like habitual individual preferences. This was nearly revolutionary softness for a culture that once wrote entire treatises about the moral consequences of curling up slightly to the left. But the Victorian legacy persisted. Even today, you'll hear people talk about right and wrong sleeping positions, echoing a century of nighttime overthinking. By the late Victorian period, insomnia had evolved into something slightly more sinister: time anxiety. It wasn't enough to lie awake at night, tossing and turning in morally incorrect positions or fretting over dreams. Now, you had to measure your wakefulness with exact precision. Because if you didn't, what kind of respectable citizen could claim to be truly awake or truly asleep? And so, the obsession with bedside clocks took hold. Clocks at the bedside, not just for telling time. Before the 19th century, most people measured sleep by approximate cues: sunrise, rooster calls, the subtle shift of shadows on the wall. But now, Victorian households, especially middle and upper class, invested in ornate, alarm-ready, glowing or ticking devices designed to keep precise watch over every hour of the night. Clocks were not neutral companions. They became judges. Ticking softly in the darkness, they silently accused. One could almost hear them muttering, 3 hours of sleep. 3 hours only. And why did you linger on your left side again? Many insomnia sufferers reported lying in bed, staring at the face of their clock, and feeling a mixture of awe, fear, and existential dread. The ticking became a soundtrack to moral self-examination. The birth of worrying the hour. Some writers described a phenomenon they called chronophobia. Not exactly the modern definition, but close enough. It meant anxiety produced by knowing the precise time while awake. Victorian manuals warned that checking the clock too often could disturb the nervous system, exacerbate insomnia, invite nightmares, or worse, shatter one's moral equilibrium. Despite the warnings, clock obsession spread. It became fashionable to have multiple clocks in the bedroom, one on the bedside table, one on the mantel, one hanging in clear view above the door. The more clocks, the more socially and morally conscientious the sleeper appeared. Alarm clocks, gentle wakefulness or public humiliation. When alarm clocks became widely available, they were marketed as tools for regulated, civilized sleep. Some had bells, some gongs, some tiny hammers that struck metal plates. But they were not always gentle. Some alarms were blaring, startling, and sufficiently aggressive to inspire nighttime dread rather than waking. Manuals advised: select your alarm with care, lest it awaken you to a morning of mental turbulence and social impropriety. This created an entire subset of the population lying awake at night, imagining the sound of the bell and preemptively worrying about its moral implications. The peculiar role of the time observer. In wealthier households, some people actually employed sleep attendants, staff whose job was to monitor the household clocks and gently nudge the alarm mechanisms if necessary. This person would ensure the timepiece was wound correctly, check for mechanical errors, Note any irregularities in tick patterns, and sometimes record whether household members were observing proper sleep conduct. Sleep became a monitored, partially bureaucratic activity. Diaries from the era include entries like, Mary slept on her right side, rising only once at 3:17 a.m. as per instructions. There is no modern equivalent, and frankly, that might be for the best. Sleep schedules as moral duty. Timekeeping didn't just measure sleep, it moralized it. Manuals and advice columns frequently claimed that a person's virtue could be inferred from their adherence to a fixed bedtime. Going to bed too late? Evidence of moral laxity. Sleeping too long? Proof of sloth. Rising late? Signs of irresponsibility and weak character. It was believed that regularized sleep patterns could improve both temperament and social standing. So households began coordinating not only their own sleep but sometimes that of visitors or servants. Insomnia, it seemed, was a threat to everyone's reputation. The psychological consequences. Predictably, Victorian night watchers and time-conscious sleepers often fell into pre-dawn anxiety cycles. They would wake naturally, check the clock, realize they had only slept X hours, worry about moral and physical consequences, attempt to return to sleep. This pattern, though predictable, was described in contemporary manuals as a test of character. Sleep difficulties were less a physiological problem and more a spiritual challenge, as if the universe itself were judging your internal discipline via the mechanical hands of a clock. Luxury clocks and social signaling. The upper class didn't just need clocks to measure sleep. They needed ornate, decorative, conspicuous clocks. It wasn't enough to track time quietly, your alarm mechanism had to demonstrate refinement and taste. Clocks became a subtle form of status signaling. Gilded brass faces, mahogany casing, miniature painted vignettes, bell or chime sophistication, displaying one's clocks in the bedroom or parlor broadcast to visitors that you valued sleep. You valued punctuality. You could afford multiple finely crafted mechanisms. And all of this silently reinforced the Victorian narrative. Sleep was important, regulated, moral, and socially visible. The long-term legacy. The obsession with clocks, alarms, and rigid schedules created a culture where time anxiety and sleep anxiety fed each other. This foundation persists today. Modern sleep tracking, smartphone alarms, apps that calculate your ideal sleep cycle, all of it echoes the Victorian belief that measuring and controlling sleep is a moral, scientific, and social imperative. By the turn of the 20th century, Victorian ingenuity had officially entered a new, slightly alarming phase: electrical sleep gadgets. The Industrial Revolution had flooded households with currents, wires, and the general hum of progress. And naturally, someone looked at insomnia and said, "Electricity. Surely it can fix everything." Thus began a wave of devices promising to stimulate slumber or calm the nerves, mostly by passing small currents through various parts of the body. If it sounds a bit ambitious, that's because it was. The rise of the electrotherapeutic bed. One of the more extreme inventions was the electrotherapeutic bed, which looked like a cross between a faintly medieval torture device and a modern reclining lounge. The promise to relieve nervous tension, induce calm muscles, balance the nervous system, and, incidentally, improve moral character. The mechanism involved wires attached to brass pads, which the user placed on the chest, hands, or feet. A small generator, usually foot or hand-cranked, produced mild shocks. Sometimes these shocks were marketed as tickling currents meant to massage the nerves gently. Users' reports vary. Some claimed deep relaxation. Others described a sensation, like being nibbled by invisible metallic insects, which is slightly less soothing. Still, the device became a status symbol, much like a well-polished grandfather clock or a properly aligned pillow. Electrical helmets and headgear. Sleep gadgets didn't stop at beds. Enter the electrical sleep helmet, a metal skullcap wired to a generator designed to send gentle currents through the brain. Medical journals of the day assured readers that a few minutes under electrical stimulation will harmonize the faculties and prepare the mind for restorative rest. Practical experience varied. Some found it relaxing. Some found it mildly alarming. A few reported dreams of mechanical rats running across their mental ceilings, though it's unclear whether that was related to the helmet or pre-existing insomnia. Still, these helmets became a curious fixture in parlor medicine, often displayed proudly alongside botanical remedies, aromatherapy, and carefully aligned pillows. The electric blanket prototype. Yes, Victorians were already experimenting with the ancestor of the modern electric blanket. Early prototypes involved heating wires embedded in fabric, controlled by dimmer-like devices. They were delicate, awkward, and sometimes sparked tiny fires if a sheet shifted. But the promise of gentle warmth controlled by human ingenuity made them irresistible to the wealthy insomnia-afflicted. Instructions for use were always stern. Do not overheat. Do not fold while energized. Do not allow children to adjust. Which, considering the alternative, cold and sleepless nights, felt worth the risk. The gentle art of electro-sleep therapy. Many doctors began offering in-home sessions for electrical sleep therapy. A patient would recline in a quiet parlor while wires were carefully attached to hands, feet, or temples. The practitioner would then regulate the current, sometimes reading aloud from a book of moral maxims or poetry, presumably to reinforce virtue while the body hummed gently. Some doctors believed that the combination of electricity, poetry, and candlelight could reprogram the nervous system. Others suspected it just encouraged temporary unconsciousness, but they allowed optimism to dominate. Public reactions and private concerns. Naturally, the public's response was mixed. Advertisements painted serene portraits of electrically soothed sleepers, calm faces bathed in soft candlelight. Testimonials were glowing, but letters to newspapers revealed more complicated truths. Some patients refused to use the devices after mild shocks. Others found the apparatus more alarming than insomnia itself. A few individuals reported headaches, jumpy muscles, or vivid dreams of metallic spiders. Despite these concerns, interest continued. Electricity was, after all, the modern marvel, capable of powering trains, lights, and apparently your nerves. Refusing it seemed almost backward. The moral and social dimension of electrical sleep. In keeping with Victorian tradition, these devices weren't just medical, they were moral. Letters and journals often suggested that sleep regulated by electricity reflected a disciplined, civilized character, whereas those who resisted innovation were prone to nervous moral failure. It was simultaneously scientific, aesthetic, and vaguely judgmental. People didn't just use electricity to sleep, they performed virtue while doing so. The legacy of Victorian electrosleep. While most of these devices disappeared within a few decades, the ideas they introduced persisted. Sleep as a measurable, controllable physiological state. Technology as a moral and aesthetic adjunct to health. An obsession with gadgets promising effortless relaxation. Sound familiar? We still measure sleep with apps, trackers, and gentle alarms. We still buy devices claiming to soothe, calm, or regulate. The Victorians merely laid the foundation, complete with mild shocks and moral undertones. And beneath all the wires, the voltages, and the moralizing, the fundamental human truth remained unchanged. Sleep is stubborn, unpredictable, and entirely unwilling to conform to science, etiquette, or virtue. But at least now, it could be electrified. After decades of elaborate gadgets, moral lectures, and mild electrical shocks, some Victorians quietly returned to a simpler approach: bedtime rituals. Not flashy, not high-tech, just soft, slow, and gentle routines designed to encourage the body and mind to settle. And in this chapter, we drift into the quieter side of Victorian insomnia remedies: the domestic, the cozy, and sometimes the aromatic. Candles and controlled light. Victorians were remarkably aware of the effect of light on sleep, although they framed it in moral and aesthetic terms. Candlelight was considered ideal, flickering, morally soothing. Some households experimented with different shapes of candles or varying candle placement, believing that the angle of light could affect the nervous system. One treatise suggested, "Let no flame flicker beyond the reach of the sleeper's peripheral vision. Disturbances in illumination disturb the spirit." Many families followed this advice, dimming the bedroom to a warm, golden glow. Others layered curtains over the candlelight to soften it further, creating small halos of serenity above nightstands or mirrors. The ritual of bedtime teas. Herbal teas were both comforting and socially acceptable remedies for insomnia. Unlike opiates or electrically charged devices, teas were gentle, slow-acting, and occasionally delightful to taste. Popular blends included chamomile, praised for nerving the passions and quieting excess thought; linden blossom, thought to encourage calm reflection; hops, which some considered almost magically soporific. Teas were served in delicate porcelain cups, sometimes with small measures of honey or sugar, and always in the quiet hour before bed. The ritual itself, preparing water, steeping herbs, sitting in soft light, was as important as the chemical effect of the drink. Bathing rituals for relaxation. Victorian medicine also emphasized the therapeutic bath, usually warm and occasionally infused with herbs or essential oils. Baths were considered a physical and moral cleansing, washing away the day's dust and industrial residue. Soothing tense muscles, calming the mind before sleep. Some manuals suggested a precise schedule: 30 minutes in a warm bath, followed by gradual towel drying and immediate bed placement to preserve warmth. Cold drafts were particularly feared. A single shiver could undo hours of moral and physical preparation. Reading before bed. Books, novels, or even poetry were sometimes used to lull the mind, but carefully. Manuals advised against exciting plots, moral controversies, or sensational news stories. Recommended reading was pastoral poetry, reflective essays, gentle moral tales. Even then, readers were cautioned to avoid direct engagement, meaning no turning pages too quickly, no emotional excitement, and no imagining dramatic plots. The goal was passive absorption, letting the words carry the mind into a calm, neutral state. Pillows, blankets, and layering. Despite the popularity of gadgets, simple layering remained central to comfort. Victorians often recommended a feather pillow for gentle support, a wool or cotton blanket for warmth without suffocation, lighter sheets to allow ventilation and prevent overheating. Some households layered blankets strategically, creating a nest of comfort that insulated the sleeper both physically and morally. The act of arranging blankets neatly, folding edges precisely, and fluffing pillows became part of the bedtime ritual, a slow, meditative preparation for rest. Music and gentle soundscapes. Although mechanical noise machines had their awkward beginnings, some Victorians turned to soft, live sound as part of evening rituals. A quietly played piano, a small harp in the corner, or a gentle wind chime near a window. The effect was subtle, low, rhythmic tones that helped the mind drift. Manuals cautioned against sudden or high-pitched sounds, which could provoke moral agitation or nervous excitement. The point was to create a slow auditory descent into calm. The philosophy of routine. At its core, these domestic rituals reflected a Victorian philosophy. Sleep could be encouraged by order, consistency, and sensory moderation. While gadgets, alarm clocks, and electric beds grabbed attention, the quietly methodical preparation, candles, teas, baths, gentle reading, proved surprisingly effective for many households. The lessons of these routines were: sleep is as much about the mind as the body. Environment matters. Calm, repeated actions signal to the nervous system that it is safe to relax. And moral and social considerations shaped even the most mundane domestic habits. The combination of these practices, light, sound, scent, temperature, and tactile comfort, produced a bedroom environment that quietly invited slumber. Nothing flashy, nothing high-tech, just soft, slow, carefully arranged domesticity. The gentle legacy. Although later sleep science abandoned the more moralistic framing, many Victorian practices endured in subtler forms. Calming lights before bedtime, warm teas or mild herbal drinks, consistent bedtime routines, quiet reflection or reading, comfortable, layered bedding. These rituals helped lay the groundwork for modern approaches to sleep hygiene, showing that sometimes the most enduring remedies are the simplest, the quietest, and the slowest. Victorian insomnia, in all its gadgetry, moralizing, and complexity, occasionally gave way to the soft, unassuming power of gentle ritual, proving that even in the midst of industrial anxiety, calm and domestic order could still guide the body toward rest. While candles, teas, and baths formed the quieter backbone of Victorian bedtime, households also explored more eccentric remedies. These were the treatments that made visitors raise an eyebrow or quietly check the etiquette manuals. Often herbal, sometimes mildly chemical, and occasionally bordering on theatrical, these remedies reflected the Victorian desire to do something, anything, to nudge sleep along. The herbal cabinet of wonders. Victorian homes frequently maintained small collections of herbs, roots, and dried flowers, usually stored in wooden drawers or glass jars. These were labeled carefully, often with slightly moralistic instructions like, "Use only as needed for calm repose. Let not the imagination be stirred. Gentle of hand, careful of spirit." Popular ingredients included valerian root, nicknamed sleep's friend, for its mild sedative properties. Hops, also used in teas or small pillows for calming scent. Skullcap, a rather dramatic name for a humble nervine herb. Chamomile and lavender, for their soft aromas and comforting effect. Some households made elaborate sachets to tuck under pillows or in drawers, creating a gentle scent trail meant to signal safety, calm, and the impending night. The curious case of nighttime lozenges. Many pharmacies produced small, patent lozenges marketed to soften the nerves and coax slumber. Ingredients ranged from soothing herbs to mild doses of opiates or sedatives. These lozenges were tiny, decorative, and often flavored with honey or licorice, making the act of taking them a ritual in itself. One could imagine a small silver dish of lozenges on a nightstand, a quiet, slow gesture performed in candlelight before bed. Manuals warned not to overuse them, of course. Yet the idea that sleep could be encouraged by a tiny, consumable object fascinated Victorians, especially those who had already invested in electrical beds, mechanical timers, and perfectly layered blankets. Aromatherapy before its time. Some households experimented with essential oils, burning incense, or steaming herbs in water to fill the bedroom with gentle fragrances. Lavender, chamomile, and rosemary were considered calming, while mint or rosemary could be used sparingly for alert dreaming, though most Victorians preferred strictly passive calm. The process was often slow and meditative, boiling herbs, pouring water carefully, allowing the aroma to spread. The rhythm of preparation itself became a signal to the nervous system that the day was ending, the household quieting, and rest was imminent. Quaint mechanical helpers. Alongside herbs, some eccentric inventors created mechanical contrivances to encourage sleep in strange ways. Examples included small rocking devices for beds or cradles, gentle vibrating pillows, wind-up devices that simulated the sound of distant waves or rainfall. While these devices were often short-lived commercially, they reflected the Victorian desire to control every possible environmental factor, from light to sound to motion, in service of sleep. Temperature and touch. Many manuals emphasize the importance of warmth, particularly the temperature of hands, feet, and bedding. Household remedies included heated stones tucked into blankets, warm foot baths before bed, layered blankets to trap gentle heat without suffocating the sleeper. The combination of touch and temperature became a ritualized form of comfort, signaling to the body that it was safe to relax. These practices were slow, deliberate, and tactile, in contrast to the more aggressive technological interventions of the same period. The social dimension of remedies. Interestingly, many of these eccentric treatments were also performative. Visitors or household members might observe the careful preparation of herbal teas, the meticulous layering of pillows and blankets, the measured placement of scented sachets. These actions conveyed care, discipline, and moral propriety. Sleep was not only personal, it was a visible social statement. By combining ritual, aroma, taste, and temperature, the Victorian bedroom became a carefully curated stage for calmness, virtue, and controlled rest. The balance of ritual and restraint. Despite the abundance of curiosities and gadgets, the most enduring principle was moderation. Too many herbs, too strong a scent, or excessive mechanical motion could disturb sleep rather than encourage it. Manuals constantly reminded households to observe quiet, avoid sudden noises, favor repetition and calm, and resist the temptation to over-intervene. The balance between eccentricity and gentle routine reflected the larger Victorian struggle: how to manage the nervous system, moral character, and daily life in an industrializing world. Legacy in modern sleep culture. Many Victorian habits persist today, subtly transformed. Herbal teas and aromatherapy. Warm foot baths or showers. Bedtime rituals that include reading, scent, or gentle music. Slow, deliberate layering of bedding. Even mechanical devices survive in spirit through white noise machines, vibrating pillows, and sleep-tracking gadgets. The emphasis on ritual, consistency, and sensory calm remains central, proving that the domestic ingenuity of the Victorian era had a lasting influence. Ultimately, these eccentric remedies reveal a society obsessed with sleep, combining curiosity, moral concern, and gentle experimentation to encourage the body toward rest. By the late Victorian era, sleep was no longer just a biological necessity or a personal nuisance. It had quietly transformed into a social signal, a subtle marker of moral character, refinement, and class distinction. Insomnia, in particular, became a topic of conversation, not in the dramatic, sensational sense, but in the polite, morally tinged language of society. The upper-class philosophy of rest. In wealthier households, sleeplessness was sometimes reframed as a symbol of refinement. If one was awake late at night, it was assumed to be because one's mind was intellectually active, one was engaged in thoughtful reflection, one had responsibilities requiring careful management. Diaries from the period often recorded pre-dawn wakefulness as a moral triumph. Rose at 3, meditated quietly upon the affairs of the household, and remained calm despite the darkness. In these circles, insomnia was almost aspirational, a sign that one was too disciplined, thoughtful, or morally engaged to succumb to ordinary sleep. The middle-class anxiety of adequate rest. For the middle classes, the situation was more complicated. Insomnia was often a source of anxiety, guilt, and social pressure. Manuals and advice columns repeatedly suggested that poor sleep reflected poorly on the character, health, and domestic management skills of the sleeper. Parents worried that children's restless nights were a sign of weak nerves or deficient upbringing. Wives fretted that husbands' sleeplessness might indicate overexertion, moral weakness, or unspoken domestic stress. Even the act of lying awake became a social performance, with the sleeper silently judged by the rhythms and order of the household. Moral interpretations of sleep patterns. Sleep patterns were often interpreted morally. Manuals suggested that sleeping too little indicated restlessness of spirit. Sleeping too much suggested laziness or indulgence. Waking frequently implied nervous instability. Dreaming vividly hinted at overactive imagination or moral indiscretion. Advice columns and medical treatises encouraged households to monitor each other's sleep politely but thoroughly. Social reputation could hinge on the perceived propriety of one's nighttime behavior. Insomnia and gendered expectations. Insomnia was also heavily gendered. Men were expected to rise early, attend to business, and demonstrate controlled wakefulness. Women were encouraged to maintain calm, serene composure in bed, which often meant sleeping gracefully, quietly, and without disturbance. Girls were instructed to adopt precise sleep positions, follow bedtime rituals, and maintain consistent schedules, reflecting their future domestic responsibilities. Failure to sleep properly implied weakness, poor moral discipline, or unrefined temperament. Servants and the observation of sleep. Even household staff were involved in this moral surveillance. In upper-class homes, sleep patterns were quietly observed, either directly or through adherence to routines dictated by the family. Servants ensured that bedrooms were maintained at proper temperature. Beds were arranged correctly. Candles and lamps were placed for ideal lighting. Nighttime disruptions were minimized. These practices reinforced social hierarchies. the household's moral and aesthetic order extended even into the private domain of the bedroom. Sleep itself became a performative duty rather than simply a physiological necessity. The language of insomnia in social writing. Letters, diaries, and essays of the period frequently treat insomnia as a worthy topic for reflection, discussion, or even subtle boasting. Phrases like, "I rose at 4 as the mind would not yield to slumber. Another restless night, yet one devoted to thought and reflection." These entries illustrate the fine line between anxiety, pride, and moral commentary. To be awake could signify either a failure of nerves or the triumph of intellect, depending on how one framed the story. Public etiquette and private reality. Despite the moralized framing, the lived reality was often far simpler. People were awake because of noise, anxiety, discomfort, or digestive irritation. Yet the discourse surrounding sleep transformed private rest into a social performance, carefully measured, judged, and discussed in subtle, genteel ways. Even mundane sleep troubles became evidence of refinement or deficiency, creating a culture in which insomnia was both personal burden and social statement. The cultural legacy of sleep as status. The Victorian emphasis on sleep as a marker of virtue, refinement, and social propriety has subtle echoes today. Consider people bragging about early rising or disciplined routines. Wellness blogs framing sleep as a moral and aesthetic practice. Ritualized bedtime routines presented as indicators of self-control and sophistication. Victorian insomnia, with all its moral weight and domestic observation, planted the seeds for a culture that continues to evaluate sleep behavior socially and culturally. Even as the era of mechanical devices, herbal concoctions, and ritualized bedrooms gave way to modernity, the notion lingered: how you sleep, when you sleep, and how you manage wakefulness reflects who you are. As the 19th century progressed, insomnia increasingly became less about physical discomfort or improper pillow arrangement and more about the mind itself. Doctors, writers, and household manuals began to describe sleeplessness as a psychological phenomenon, a time when the mind drifted into worry, melancholy, and reflection, often entirely without permission. The gentle rise of nocturnal anxiety. Victorians were particularly sensitive to the idea that nighttime amplified personal flaws and domestic failures. While the day demanded action, productivity, and public composure, night offered quiet spaces in which the mind could wander unchecked. An individual might lie awake pondering. Unfinished letters. Household tasks undone. Moral obligations unmet. Social interactions mismanaged. Each thought could slowly spiral, producing a mild but persistent nocturnal anxiety, which many manuals described in somber, clinical terms. Melancholy as a bedfellow. Insomnia was often accompanied by melancholy, a state considered both delicate and highly respectable in Victorian culture. Unlike modern depressive descriptions, this melancholy was framed as thoughtful, reflective, morally attuned, occasionally aesthetic. Sleep-deprived individuals would quietly ruminate on literature, art, or ethical dilemmas. Diaries are filled with entries like, "The candle flickered and my mind wandered to distant friends and past errors. Slumber would not attend." This melancholy was seen as evidence of depth, a signal that the individual's nerves were finely tuned to the subtleties of life, emotion, and morality. The practice of quiet reflection. Victorian manuals often advised that sleepless nights could be put to good use through gentle reflection. Recommended exercises included journaling thoughts in soft, flowing script, reciting poetry aloud in whisper, meditating quietly on moral or ethical questions, observing the night sky for calm, structured perspective. The intention was to channel wakefulness into disciplined, morally constructive activity rather than simply lying in anxious despair. Dreams, imagination, and moral overtones. Even during these reflective nights, dreams, or at least the anticipation of them, played a role in shaping mental life. Manuals warned that an active imagination could encourage unsettling or morally questionable thoughts. Readers were encouraged to mentally catalog daily actions, reflect on virtuous or charitable deeds, Avoid excessive engagement with fiction or sensational stories. In other words, the ideal Victorian sleepless night was quiet, ordered, and morally upright, even as the mind wandered through personal anxieties and contemplations. The gentle anxiety of the nervous system. Medical writers increasingly linked insomnia to delicate nervous systems, particularly in the middle and upper classes. Symptoms were described with charming understatement: mild palpitations, restless limbs, occasional flushes of heat or chill, low-level agitation of thought. Rather than a crisis, this nervousness was interpreted as evidence of refinement, sensitivity, and the capacity for moral and aesthetic discernment. The role of letters and diaries. Victorian sleeplessness was often accompanied by the ritual recording of thought, either in diaries or letters. Individuals would recount daily events, reflect on successes or shortcomings, compose moral aphorisms, plan minor household adjustments for the next day. These practices served as both mental organization and mild moral correction, offering a sense of purpose even when slumber was elusive. Nighttime as a space of slow contemplation. In these accounts, sleepless nights were never simply empty. They were spaces of gentle contemplation, allowing individuals to confront themselves in slow, reflective ways. Anxiety was acknowledged, but tempered by ritual, moral reflection, and the quiet repetition of domestic habits. Adjusting pillows, sipping warm tea, noting observations in a small journal, observing candles or moonlight through curtained windows. The night became a slow, meditative practice in which even wakefulness could be transformed into calm, deliberate activity. The subtle moral economy of wakefulness. Victorians treated wakefulness as morally meaningful. One's ability to endure a sleepless night without panic, without indulgence, and with quiet reflection became a measure of self-discipline, moral character, and social refinement. Even anxiety and melancholy, carefully managed, were recast as evidence of sensitivity and virtue rather than purely as sources of distress. Sleeplessness, in other words, could be noble if undertaken with proper attention, ritual, and reflective calm. The quiet legacy of Victorian insomnia. Many of these practices and perceptions quietly shaped modern attitudes toward sleeplessness. Keeping journals or notebooks by the bedside. Gentle reflection as a coping mechanism. Viewing wakefulness as an opportunity rather than a failure. Cultivating domestic rituals to aid calm. The Victorians, with all their anxieties, gadgets, and eccentric remedies, created a culture of deliberate, measured insomnia, transforming the restless night into a space for contemplation, ritual, and moral attention. By the early hours of the morning, Victorian households had settled into a delicate, quiet rhythm. For those awake, either by insomnia, nervous habit, or moral discipline, the hours before dawn became a time of soft domestic ritual and meditative activity. These pre-dawn moments were neither dramatic nor urgent. They were slow, measured, and gently performative. The gentle stirring of the household. In upper and middle-class homes, servants or household attendants often began their quiet, almost invisible work in these hours. Lighting low, steady lamps. Stoking fires just enough to create warmth without smoke. Preparing water for tea or bath. Checking bed linens and pillows. Each movement was deliberate, slow, and unobtrusive. Noise was minimized. The goal was to support the household without disturbing the moral and physical calm of those still lying, or attempting to lie, in bed. The ritual of early tea. Tea was a cornerstone of pre-dawn life for those awake. The act of brewing and sipping a warm, aromatic beverage was both comforting and socially coded. Certain teas were recommended specifically for early hours. Chamomile and linden for calm. Mild green teas for gentle stimulation. Diluted herbal infusions for a soft awakening. The rhythm of pouring, steeping, and sipping became almost meditative, signaling a gradual transition from night to day, with neither hurry nor moral panic. Household reflection and planning. Victorian manuals suggested that the pre-dawn hours were ideal for reviewing household plans, composing letters or journal entries, quietly managing finances or schedules, planning minor domestic adjustments. The key was calm, structured attention. Wakefulness was no longer a problem. It was an opportunity for deliberate contemplation and domestic management, conducted in near silence to preserve both personal and communal serenity. The role of light. Lighting in the pre-dawn hours was carefully managed. Soft candlelight, dim lamps, or small oil lights provided enough illumination for gentle tasks without disrupting the quiet, reflective atmosphere. Manuals warned against harsh light, which could provoke nervous agitation, moral distraction, premature alertness. Instead, light was considered a soft guide, marking the shift from night to day in measured, intentional increments. Exercise and gentle movement. Some households incorporated slow, minimal movement to prepare the body for the approaching day. Manuals recommended gentle stretching or flexing, careful walking around a room, arranging linens or tidying small areas. Movement was never hurried or vigorous. It was measured and precise, maintaining the moral and physical disciplines so central to Victorian thinking about the body. Quiet social observation. For those awake, observing the household, without participating loudly, was a subtle social exercise. One might note, a servant quietly stirring the tea, a fire's gentle flicker, curtains drawn to maintain warmth and privacy. These moments encouraged awareness without intrusion, a form of quiet, ethical attentiveness that extended moral vigilance into the still hours before sunrise. Reflection on dreams and memory. Pre-dawn hours were also a space for mental review. Victorians often recounted dreams or nightmares, reflected on emotions and moral conduct, quietly assessed personal progress or setbacks. The practice was slow, almost ritualized, and conducted with gentle moral framing. Dreams were hints, reflections of the soul, or reminders of virtue or caution. The soft transition to morning. By the time daylight crept through windows or chimneys, the pre-dawn rituals had quietly prepared the household for the day. Those who had been awake often felt a gentle sense of accomplishment, having navigated night with calm reflection, measured domestic attention, deliberate mental and physical discipline. Morning arrived without fanfare, but with subtle order. The household was aligned, the body and mind prepared, and even insomnia had contributed to a softly structured, morally attentive start. Legacy of pre-dawn practice. These hours reflect the Victorian talent for ritual, domestic order, and reflective wakefulness. They were slow, quiet, and meticulously structured, not for productivity in the modern sense, but to cultivate calm, moral attention and gentle awareness. Even today, elements of these practices persist in habits like journaling before sunrise, quiet morning tea, gentle movement or stretching, mindful observation of the household or environment. The pre-dawn Victorian world reminds us that wakefulness need not be stressful. With ritual, reflection, and calm attention, the night and early morning could become spaces of measured contemplation and gentle preparation. By the late Victorian period, centuries of insomnia practices, moral reflection, gadgets, and gentle rituals had coalesced into a comprehensive domestic approach to sleeplessness. Households cultivated a slow, deliberate rhythm that allowed wakefulness and rest to coexist, often uneasily, but with a persistent sense of order, propriety, and moral reflection. Ritual as a stabilizing force. The central principle of Victorian insomnia management was ritual. Bedtime, wakefulness, and pre-dawn activity were governed by careful, repeated patterns that prepared the body for rest, signaled moral and social attentiveness, provided psychological comfort through predictability. Candles, teas, baths, layered bedding, and herbal remedies were all components of this domestic choreography, each step slow, deliberate, and gentle. Even minor actions, the folding of sheets, the placement of a sachet, the stirring of a teacup, were small markers of control and calm. The integration of technology and tradition. Despite the prominence of simple rituals, mechanical and electrical devices maintained a supporting role. Clocks, alarms, vibrating pillows, and electrotherapeutic beds coexisted with soft candlelight, herbal teas, pre-dawn reflection, slow, measured movement, The result was a hybrid environment where modern invention and centuries-old domestic wisdom mutually reinforced the goal of calm, ordered sleep. Household hierarchies and sleep management. Insomnia management was not purely personal, it was embedded in domestic hierarchy. Household staff played subtle but essential roles: maintaining quiet, regulating temperature, preparing herbal or tea remedies, observing pre-dawn activity. By supporting these rituals, servants helped sustain the household's moral and domestic equilibrium. Sleep, wakefulness, and even insomnia became shared responsibilities, quietly reinforcing social order and refinement. Moral and psychological dimensions. Victorian insomnia was always tied to moral character. Wakefulness, when properly managed, was seen as evidence of sensitivity and refinement, an opportunity for self-reflection, a demonstration of control over nerves and habits. Conversely, mismanaged insomnia, through anxiety, restlessness, or indulgence, was interpreted as a lapse in discipline, moral judgment, or domestic responsibility. This moral framing transformed what could have been a purely physiological struggle into a complex cultural practice where mind, body, and household order intersected. The gentle architecture of the night. Throughout the evening and into the pre-dawn hours, Victorian households arranged the night as a carefully structured environment. Light and shadow managed for psychological comfort. Warmth, bedding, and touch calibrated for gentle stability. Sound and aroma controlled to guide relaxation. Reflective practices interwoven to occupy the mind without excitement. Even insomnia had its place in this architecture. The restless mind could be gently channeled into observation, journaling, or contemplation, ensuring that wakefulness contributed to a coherent, morally attentive domestic order. The domestic legacy. By integrating ritual, reflection, gentle remedies, and subtle technology, Victorians created a model of domestic resilience. Insomnia was no longer merely a nuisance, it was a structured opportunity for moral and mental refinement, a shared domestic practice influencing household harmony, a stage for subtle social and cultural signaling. Modern echoes of these practices appear in bedtime routines emphasizing calm, repetition, and reflection, pre-sleep rituals with teas, reading, or gentle music, measured observation of light, warmth, and sound, structured mindfulness or journaling habits. Victorians, with all their obsessive clocks and curious gadgets, understood that sleep and its absence could be domesticated, integrated into ritual, and framed as a gentle, morally and socially significant practice. The calm conclusion. In the end, Victorian insomnia was less about panic or dramatic sleeplessness than about quietly negotiating life in the hours when the world was still. Through ritual, reflection, and careful domestic management, wakefulness became an opportunity rather than a failure, a gentle domain in which the mind, body, and household coexisted in soft, deliberate harmony. Sleep, when it arrived, was both a physical relief and a moral affirmation. And even when it did not, the night itself had been carefully, thoughtfully, and almost ritualistically spent, a quiet achievement in human patience, domestic care, and reflective attention. By the time the household has navigated candles, teas, baths, herbal remedies, clocks, and gentle rituals, insomnia takes on a slightly different character. It is no longer merely a problem to be managed. It becomes a slow teacher, imparting lessons in patience, observation, and the subtle rhythms of domestic life. Learning from the night. Victorians often noted that the night itself had its own tempo and wisdom. While the world outside slept, the household, or the individual awake, experienced a rare silence punctuated only by fires, wind, or distant footsteps, slow shifts in light and shadow, a gentle awareness of domestic processes, even in stillness. In these hours, wakefulness was not a failure but a space for noticing the otherwise unnoticed. The way candlelight flickers across polished furniture, the faint scent of herbs lingering from evening preparations, the subtle, orderly movement of household staff. The night taught mindfulness long before the term existed. The ethical dimension of wakefulness. Victorian manuals repeatedly framed sleeplessness as an opportunity for moral attention. The mind could wander, yes, but ideally it wandered with purpose, reflection, and gentle self-discipline. Letters and diaries often reflected this ethical framing. Though the hours are long and sleep is slow to come, I find myself contemplating the small duties and moral affairs of the household, grateful for the quiet attention the night affords. Wakefulness became an ethically charged space, a time to observe, reflect, and gently correct one's own conduct or domestic management. Observation and patience. Insomnia also cultivated acute observation skills. In these slow hours, Victorians noted small variations in household temperature, the behavior of pets, subtle changes in weather, minor imperfections in domestic arrangements. The restless, careful mind became a patient, attentive one, learning to see patterns, anticipate needs, and notice details that daytime haste often obscured. Quiet creativity. Some individuals transformed sleepless hours into gentle creativity. Diaries, letters, sketches, or reflective essays emerged not in the rushed light of day, but in the calm, careful attention of pre-dawn wakefulness. Creativity in these hours was so methodical, deeply introspective, rarely shared immediately. The night, it seemed, encouraged thoughtful expression, favoring depth over speed and reflection over sensation. The cultural role of sleeplessness. Insomnia in Victorian culture also played a subtle cultural function. It allowed refinement of domestic order, reinforcement of moral and social norms, cultivation of patience and endurance, careful, reflective engagement with personal and household life. In this sense, sleeplessness was socially, morally, and domestically integrated. It was not merely a nuisance, but a structured, culturally meaningful part of life for those who had the luxury or the burden of the night. The gentle rhythm of reflection. By observing the night, Victorian sleepers, or partial sleepers, learned the value of patience, the subtle power of routine, the importance of calm, deliberate attention, the quiet moral and psychological utility of wakefulness. Even worry and restlessness were reframed as opportunities for reflection and self-discipline, rather than purely negative experiences. Modern echoes. Many practices born of Victorian sleeplessness still resonate today, quietly shaping contemporary habits. Mindfulness and meditation practices before sleep, journaling or reflective writing in quiet hours, attention to sensory environments, light, sound, temperature, ritualized, calming routines to signal readiness for rest. Victorian insomnia, though culturally and morally loaded, left a legacy of patience, observation, and reflective domesticity that persists in subtle modern form. The soft wisdom of the night. Ultimately, sleeplessness in Victorian households was less a crisis and more a slow, gentle teacher. Through wakefulness, one learned careful observation, moral attentiveness, reflective patience, the slow rhythms of domestic life. The night, once feared as empty and restless, could become a quiet companion, guiding the mind and household into patterns of calm, disciplined, and reflective activity. By the late Victorian era, insomnia, domestic rituals, and reflective wakefulness had become fully integrated into household design. The bedroom was no longer just a place to sleep, it was a carefully curated environment, designed to support calm, moral, and physically regulated rest, even when sleep refused to arrive. The Victorian bedroom as a moral and sensory space. Victorian bedrooms reflected status, taste, and attentional control. They were arranged with careful attention to light, soft lamps, layered curtains, and strategic candle placement. Temperature management, heated bricks, layered bedding, and precise window ventilation. Scent, herbs, sachets, and gentle infusions to create calm olfactory cues. Minimal disruption, smooth floors, silent locks, and careful furniture arrangement. The bedroom was a moral as well as physical environment, where calmness and propriety were reinforced by the very design of space. Even insomnia could be managed gently by surrounding oneself with order, routine, and sensory predictability. Furniture and domestic rituals. Beds were often carefully constructed with multiple layers of bedding to trap warmth, feather or wool pillows for gentle support, clean, pressed sheets to ensure tactile comfort. Nightstands, lamps, and small cabinets were positioned for easy access to teas, journals, or small remedies, allowing even the restless or wakeful individual to maintain order and ritual. Other furniture, chairs, tables, and writing desks, was arranged for slow, reflective activity, enabling journaling, letter writing, or gentle observation without disturbing the household. Lighting as a gentle guide. Lighting remained central. Candlelight, oil lamps, and the earliest electric lamps were carefully chosen and positioned to encourage calm without abrupt stimulation, provide just enough visibility for pre-dawn rituals, allow reflection, reading, or observation without harsh glare. Manuals frequently warned against sudden changes in illumination, noting that abrupt light could stimulate the nervous system and undermine the carefully cultivated calm of the room. Sound, silence, and household rhythm. Silence was a carefully maintained virtue. Outside noises were buffered by thick walls, carpets, and curtains. Within the room, the only acceptable sounds were gentle rustling of sheets or clothing, the low flicker of fire, quiet sips of tea, deliberate scratching of pen on paper. Even natural noises, wind, rain, or birds, were integrated into the reflective rhythm of the household, often noticed and appreciated rather than feared or ignored. Pre-dawn spaces for reflection. For those awake before sunrise, the bedroom was a stage for quiet, slow contemplation. Activities included journaling or letter writing, sipping gentle herbal teas, meditative observation of the night sky or candlelit, arranging bedding or personal items as part of ritualized preparation. Even insomnia had a structured, almost ceremonial place within these routines, allowing wakefulness to contribute to personal and domestic order. The integration of technology. Mechanical and electrical devices were present, but in supportive, non-intrusive roles. Clocks, timers, and early electrical beds complemented traditional routines rather than dominating them. The emphasis remained on slow, deliberate action, sensory calm, moral and domestic order.